So the theme for this panel is Clearing the Air, where are we 5 years on? And it harks back to a series that CPR began in 2017, which was an effort to try and understand the landscape around air pollution, in, not just in Delhi, but in the rest of the country, trying to unpack issues around the sort of policy frameworks, the sectoral transitions that are required, specific seasonal issues like stubble burning, and engagement of the public and communities at large in sort of policy making and implementation related to air quality. And so in the 5 years since the series was launched, we've had several major developments in the landscape around air quality. In 2017, you had new standards come into force for thermal power plants, which still haven't come into implementation for a variety of reasons. You had the Supreme Court's landmark judgment around leadership of the state pollution control boards. The turn of 2018 and 2019, you had the Green Crackers order passed by the Supreme Court and several bans on firecracker use. The National Clean Air Program was launched under the secretaryship of one of the gentlemen who's going to be on our panel today. In 2020, we had the CAQM ordinance was passed, replacing the erstwhile EPCA. BS6 was introduced as a fuel transition here in Delhi and slowly in the rest of the country. But on the flip side, we also saw the slowdown of, or slow phase down of subsidies under the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, which at that time was the single largest air pollution mitigation strategy nationwide. In 2021, the CAQM ordinance lapsed and an act was passed in Parliament and it was reconstituted, and essentially it became the first effort at airshed level regulation of air quality in India. In 2021, we had the 15th Finance Commission grants to urban local bodies to fight air pollution, over 4,000 crores a year, substantial investment of a kind we've never seen before in building capacity to address air quality in cities. And most recently, we've had revised targets for the NCAP, making them much more ambitious, targets to reduce air pollution by 2026. There have been slightly controversial amendments to the Air and EP Act that have been proposed. And there is a committee which is currently working on revising India's national air quality standards to be more in line with the WHO guidelines that were updated late last year. But in these 5 years, in spite of all of these substantial transitions that have occurred, we've seen limited progress. Right? Gains in air quality have been limited. Part of this is a boost that has been provided by COVID-induced lockdowns and economic slowdowns. We have a substantial number of big picture policies in place. We have NCAP, we have CAQM, but coordination and appropriate nested structures to facilitate the implementation of these policies are really lacking. Substantial funds are now available, but large amounts of these funds are being diverted towards untested techno-fixes, things like smog towers, happy seeders, decomposers. A necessary precondition to achieve improvements in air quality over the long term, which is these long-term sectoral transitions that we need to see happening at scale across sectors like transport, stubble, and power are at different stages of implementation, although ambitious targets again have been set in each one of those. And there is a sort of newer discourse that's coming to the picture where silver bullets, such as say emissions trading schemes, are seen as the solution to what is largely a state capacity problem. And the last is really this question of institutional capacity, especially of our regulators at the state level, our STCBs, which is a deeply concerning issue that has been brought up over the last 20 years by various individuals, including parliaments, including civil society organizations, the government itself. And this is where we're focusing a little bit of our lens today and releasing a small piece of work that we've done titled The State of India's Pollution Control Board. So this is work that we did across all 10 pollution control boards in the Indo-Gangetic Plain, including the Delhi Pollution Control Committee, trying to understand really three aspects. The first is the boards themselves. As an entity, they're a little dated in their structure. They're remnants of a different way of functioning back in the day. But these boards are an important entity in trying to figure out who has a seat at the table, really. Who is on these boards? Are they industry? Are they civil society? Are they government departments? And essentially, are they really aiding the board in furthering its mandate on regulating air quality? Second is who is at the helm of these boards? Who are the chairpersons and the member secretaries? What are their qualifications? What is their expertise in managing issues around air quality? And the third is who is really in the field? We've all heard anecdotally that there's substantial capacity constraints in pollution control boards. If this is the case, who is really conducting inspections? Who's able to, is the board really able to effectively act on its mandate on things, basic functions like consent management, on inspection, monitoring, and enforcement. So with respect to the composition of the boards, what we found largely is that there are two groups which comprise the vast majority of membership across all 10 boards that we examined. The first is state government departments, and so most boards have substantial representation from other relevant line departments, whether it be transport, whether it be industry, whether it be power, whether it be urban local bodies as well, which are represented substantially on these boards. But the group that is highly underrepresented across the board is academics, scientists, medical practitioners, anybody from the public health sector. And so you can see the difference here. State government departments are roughly 37%. Industry and local authorities are between 18 and 25%, but academics, scientists, anybody with air quality expertise is less than 7% of the board composition. And civil society or any potentially affected parties are missing altogether from these boards. With respect to who's at the helm, I think this figure may be slightly difficult to read, but essentially the question we asked was, what was the tenure of the previous 5 chairpersons of each one of these pollution control boards? With a view to trying to understand how long they've spent and what the sort of temporality of their terms was over a period of time. And so we can see here that, for instance, you have up top, Bihar, the last 5 chairpersons' terms extend all the way back to 2004, whereas for a state like Delhi, for instance, the last 5 chairpersons only go all the way back to early 2016, essentially reflecting the fact that their tenures have varied from anywhere between 18 days to 5.5 years. Now, the question of why this is important is that how do you execute on a long-term strategy if your chair is changing every 6 months or every year or every 2 years? There needs to be some level of continuity in policy making to ensure that they're around. The other aspect is not all of them are full-time, chairpersons or member secretaries for that matter. For instance, in Bihar, the chairperson is currently full-time and is a scientist as well. Whereas in Delhi, the previous chairperson was part-time earlier. They've changed their recruitment rules recently, and we don't know who the new chairperson is going to be yet. But we also are unclear whether it's going to be part-time or full-time. And in Chhattisgarh, for instance, the person is notionally full-time, but currently the person who holds the position is also additional chief secretary in the state and is responsible for the chief minister's office and for the industries department. So how is he full-time if he holds 2 additional charges? And the third is, within these boards, who is really doing the work? There are technical staff within each of these boards, engineers and scientists who are responsible for carrying out the mandate of the board, which is going and inspecting industries, examining whether they're meeting the basic emissions and effluent standards that they're required to on a day-to-day basis. And if you can see here, the proportion of occupied posts, technical posts for environmental engineers and scientists is in green, vacant posts is in red. And if you can see across the board, over half of them have less than 50% of their posts occupied. So Bihar is at 11% occupied. Haryana is at 11 of the 11 of the positions are occupied right now. Haryana has 65 occupied and 169 unoccupied. Jharkhand is 15 and 65 vacant. So a substantial number of them are functioning well below even 50% capacity for. And how do you regulate a rapidly growing industrial sector with this kind of staff constraint? And this has been true since 2009 when the CSE published its report, 2008 when there was a parliamentary standing committee analysis trying to understand the vacancy rates, and it has been largely true since that period of time. And the startling thing is many of them have not even hired in 20 years, which is a truly remarkable situation. And the people who they've hired 20, 25 years ago are now coming to retirement age. And so they're going to fall off a cliff. Now, with these kinds of vacancy rates, what we find is that on average, let's assume an engineer has a certain number of tasks to complete to perform a basic inspection, review a consent application from an industry, for instance. So that means reviewing the application itself, going and conducting an inspection, collecting air, water data to analyze in a lab, writing up a report, and finally issuing the consent. That's a substantial amount of work that they need to do. But on average, if we look at the occupied posts, which are in pink, in Bihar, for instance, they have less than half a day to complete that kind of work. In Chhattisgarh, they have a little over a day. Jharkhand, Punjab, and Uttar Pradesh all have less than a day, essentially, to review and grant one consent application. Now, we, of course, understand that many industries don't necessarily require this kind of work to be done. So there are white and green category industries, for instance, where you may not require a field inspection, but that's still a substantial concern that needs to be flagged. So looking ahead, we thought this panel might be a useful opportunity to sort of unpack where we feel we need to focus our attention over the next 5 years. So what are the foundational doctrines that are needed to drive air quality improvements in the next 5 years? And we thought these are the 3 areas that we need to work on. And our panel also helpfully represents these 3 areas, which is augmenting policy frameworks. We have a former secretary here with us who will be able to talk about how to enhance policy frameworks around air quality, how to make it intersectoral, how do we integrate health into environmental policy making. The second is fostering these conditions for sectoral transitions. Now, we've had a substantial amount of money go into addressing the issue of stubble burning, but we have the perspective of somebody who works in the farmer community to talk to us really about what are the sort of longer term transitions that need to happen here. And third is rapidly building institutional capacity. Now, if India has ambitions to grow its industrial sector as we've seen over the last 10, 15 years or so, we need to augment institutional capacity substantially going forward, and Shibani will speak a little bit to that. And with that, I'll quickly introduce our panel. Our moderator today is Jayashree Nandi, who's an environmental journalist from the Hindustan Times. We also have with us Mr. C.K. Mishra, a retired IAS officer, formerly secretary both in the Ministry of Environment and in the Ministry of Health. Mr. Ajay Veer Jhakar, who's president of the Bharat Krishak Samaj, and Shibani Ghosh, my colleague and a fellow at the Initiative on Climate, Energy and Environment at CPR. With that, Jayashree, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Bhargav. Very, very useful research that, sort of gives, it's an eye-opener for us because we've only been hearing about how there are institutional capacity constraints, but now we actually have a real picture of what's happening. I would just like to start with taking you back as to how the narrative has changed over the past 10 years. I've been covering air pollution for the past 10 years or so. And there was a time when there was no air quality index. We basically there were few monitoring stations, and you would have to take the concentrations and then compare it with the safe standard. And it was a very complicated issue. It was difficult to explain it to your editors as to what you're trying to do. And there were lots of limitations in terms of making linkages with health concerns. Like even within the newsrooms about 10 years ago, it was difficult to say that this actually causes premature deaths, because then, people would say, that's too much of a stretch. Are you sure that this is happening? So now we are at a point where we have a color-coded air quality index, and it's very easy for people to understand what's the air quality like. We also have a national air quality, the National Clean Air Program, which is time-bound and which has clear targets. But I've also seen in between a lot of desperate measures like, having smog towers, then having, a lot of focus on garbage and natural dust, which is well placed and taken, but also there are other sources that need to be handled. So it is a very stubborn problem. It is a very complex problem, but definitely from a journalist point of view and from the narrative as to how it has changed from defensiveness of how this is not happening to being more responsive. Yes, it is happening. So welcome to the panel. And so I'm going to mostly ask you questions about, air quality reforms and what are the stumbling blocks on that. And I'll start with Mr. Mishra. So you were there when NCAP was being conceptualized, and I've met you when this was happening. So in India, the two main stumbling blocks seem to be the fact that we do not have good scalable ideas which are based on science. And there's also very limited technical capacity, like Bhargav has pointed out. So how do you think this can be dealt with?
Well, two issues that you raised. One is about technical capacity and the other is about scalable ideas. If you ask me, the answer to the technical capacity is a bit yes, a bit of a no. Answer to the scalable ideas and implementable ideas is a big no. Now, what are we trying to do? We are, over the years, we have learned how to best use the capacity, but we are using it only for purposes that we think define air quality. So, at the end of the day, science has to be the basis of all this. But let us say, let me give you two examples and explain this. One you just mentioned. How did we know that the air quality was bad? I mean, it could have been there for several years. But the moment the continuous monitoring system started, you knew. So a technology was in. Today, the technology is not a single source dependent technology. There are various local air quality inputs. So technology has grown. The point is, with the technology and with the measurement in place and with the grading system that you just spoke about, what next? So where we have really failed is, where do we take off after that? You spoke about the National Clean Air Program. To be very honest to you, I was extremely excited when the plan was made and when we released the first round of money to the states. But to be very honest, I'll share with you that's been a disappointing journey. The reason being that one day I sat and saw some of the plans that had come from the state governments. They were almost photocopies of each other. That is not the way you tackle air quality. The solution to cleaning the air cannot be same in every part of the country, particularly in India. The Indo-Gangetic Plain, for example, needs a completely different solution than the rest of the country. But the issue is that we have not been using very effectively appropriate technology at the appropriate time. For the last 5 years, you began with that. For the last 5 years, every year we tweak the same action points that we mentioned 5 years back. The English is a little different. The meaning remains the same. So, I think there is an issue of capacity. And we need to address this. And we need to address this in both ways in terms of science. I don't think technology is a big barrier. There's enough technology available. It's about how do we take technology to the field. And whenever we talk about air quality, unfortunately, whether it is the capacity or the implementation ideas, we've done a lot in technology. You spoke about BS6. I mean, that's another story. There's a lot of focus on the transport sector, for example. Much of Delhi, though, suffers from construction sector, but there's a lot of focus on transport sector. So, technology in that sector has moved so fast that implementations become a problem. While the entire automotive industry was struggling with BS6, we immediately said, no, BS6 is not enough, let's go for EV. Now that everybody is trying to switch over to EV, it's hydrogen. So, we are not allowing a technology to settle down and actually show impact. And let us please understand, NCR is not India. And air quality is not about NCR. And that is the main point of implementation that we need to keep in mind.
Sure, thank you so much. Shibani, a follow-up question to this. Coming to institutional capacity and technical capacity, what are the constraints with institutional governance on air quality in India? And have we moved in the last 5 years? Do you see any progress?
Thank you so much, Jayashree. And I think I'll just take on from where Mr. Mishra actually left. I think the problem of air pollution and the sources of air pollution, the nature of air pollution in India and various parts of India, the nature of it is multi-sectoral. And the way our institutions are currently set up, they're just not competent to undertake that kind of convening, coordination across departments, across levels of government, national, state, urban, local bodies. That's just not the way our institutions have been designed. And that's the way the institutions have been functioning over decades. So if we are going to now tackle this really difficult, complex problem, we really have to rethink a lot of our institutional design, and that's a huge challenge. And in so many ways, there's so much inertia and changing things about the government that this certainly is not something that we currently are prioritizing. The second issue is, I think, about airshed regulation, and I think Bhargav mentioned that during his presentation, and we see there's kind of a move towards that. NCAP actually mentions that. CAQM is an example of where airshed regulation could go, but we really need to move on it, because we are set up along administrative jurisdictions. The Air Act, the Water Act, State Pollution Control Board's powers are all along state boundaries. Even the way the fund is flowing is to a municipal corporation. So again, we are going down the conventional jurisdictional route, which is really not the way air quality regulation can take place, and therefore I think that's the second big challenge. And the third big challenge, and I'm hoping we can speak about it a little more later, is of course regulatory capacity. And our research, some of which Bhargav referred to, and we are hoping that we'll engage more on this as our reports come out in the following weeks, it's so weak. And while we have only looked at the state pollution control boards in the IGP region, it's also other departments. I mean, air quality is not just the jurisdiction of state pollution control boards, state environment departments. Look at the environment impact assessment process. Everything affects air quality. And so to actually think in that integrated fashion is something that we are not doing currently, and I don't know if we're set up to do. If the needle is moving, I think yes, but so slow, so incrementally that I don't think it's sufficient to kind of meet the public health challenge that we are faced with. I think CAQM in that sense is, in terms of the fact that it accepts airshed to be the level of regulation, it's a good way, is a positive note. The fact that there is fund flow is a positive note. The fact that NCAP acknowledged the fact that we need targets and all is a good, but I think a lot more needs to be done and just not enough as of now.
Shivani, so public health concern, I mean, I would like to ask Mr. Mishra, because you have had experience of how public health concerns can be sort of woven into environmental policy, particularly air quality. And we've had there was a period when we were not open to accepting that air quality causes a lot of problems, including low birth weight, premature mortality. And now there are actually reports saying that it is the greatest health threat in India, even higher than perhaps smoking and malnutrition.
See, this intersection of air quality and health is a very interesting one, provided you acknowledge that there is one that exists. And that is the first problem. The second problem is that in India, health is about treatment and not about public health in all the public discourse. So unless we get out of this mindset, we are not going to reach there. Now, we've been arguing for a long time that the mortality and morbidity that we claim is happening because of bad air quality is actually not directly attributable to air quality. No post-mortem report will say that he died because the PM level 2.5 was 410. So it will never be directly attributable. But the fact remains that air quality has a very adverse impact on overall health and well-being. Let's forget health for a minute, if it sounds too, jarring to everyone. Well-being. It actually impacts your daily life. So I think the treatment lies not so much on the medical side, but more on the understanding side, where we need to feel that a person needs to thrive, survive, and do well in life. Now, what are we doing? We created a mission, if you recall, 2019, 18, I don't remember, 19. We created a different, separate mission on health.
Yes.
Between two departments, it got stuck. The problem is that we get so defensive about things that are so factual in the field that we are not able to find a solution, which is obviously there. So what we need to do is twofold. A, after having acknowledged this, that is, A, actually assess, research, and lay down from the Indian point of view what are the ill impacts of poor air quality. There have been many global reports, not all of them would apply to the Indian situation. First, that research. Having done that, there are two aspects of dealing with it. One is to make people aware, if there are precautions at all, to follow them. And the second is gear up to reduce the risk of morbidity and mortality. You can't just do away with it, but if we can have a plan in place to actually invest in the health facilities, in recognizing and reducing risks out of air quality, I think we would have done well. But let me tell you that it's about life. Air quality is subsidiary. The critical element is life. So we need to pay more focus on that than just bad air quality.
Yeah, sure. And an issue related to this, which sort of takes all of us in Delhi into gloom every November and December, Mr. Jakhar. Not just in Delhi, in fact, all of many parts of Northwest India, and I'm traveling to Punjab and Haryana next week to understand what's going on with the stubble burning scenario. A lot has happened in the past 5 years. Several interventions have been made and huge amounts of funds have been invested in the mechanization process, of course, but also biodecomposers, and now there are various XC2 plans also connecting farmers with power plants, with other kinds of initiatives, so that the stubble can be actually transported and worked out. So firstly, please help us take stock of what has happened on ground and what is the acceptance like of these fixes.
Thank you for this opportunity, but I want to go a step back to this report, the state of India's pollution control boards. I think it misses a very crucial point, which is that the boards do exactly what they're supposed to do. They're not supposed to ruffle feathers. That's why they don't work. It's about the boards not having the political mandate to deliver. And that's why they're formed like this. And I'll give you an example, because pesticide pollution is also a pollution that also needs to be looked at where I come from.
Yes.
Now, pollution data about pesticide is generated by the industry, which is taken at face value by the agriculture institutions, and permission is given for that pesticide usage. So whoever is generating the data is the one who's selling the data. Same thing happens with the ministry, and why I'm coming there is because there's a link. The ministry, the agriculture ministry, is the one telling farmers to use pesticides, and they are the ones regulating the pesticide use. So till you don't have independent boards, it's not going to work. But it's political interference. So I think pollution is not it's not a technology fix issue. As the panel is saying, it's a governance issue. At the end of it, it's a simple governance issue. You talked about, so what's happening, taking stock. I would say that government has tried, it has not succeeded. Did government try hard enough? It did not try hard enough. And the real failure is not learning from innumerable failures over the last 5-10 years. That's the real failure, I would say. Now, because the focus seems to be on Delhi, we have a government in Delhi which spent 68 lakh rupees buying these decomposers and spent 23 crore rupees advertising the use of that 68 lakh rupees of biodecomposers. And these biodecomposers come from PUSA, which is an agriculture institution which doesn't even claim them to be biodecomposers, but the media goes mad calling them decomposers. PUSA actually calls them stimulators, but the government loves to advertise it as decomposers, and they don't work. I tried it on my farm, they don't work. Now, air pollution does not only impact human beings, it impacts even the other living beings in the soil, and it impacts crop burning, impacts everything. Now, there is no political will to stop crop burning, and that's why crop burning does not stop. It is not a technology fix that will solve it. But if we have time, I can go into that, but I don't know if other questions relate that. It's not a technology fix that is lacking. It is not, yes, money is lacking. Who's going to pay for the transformation? That needs to be said.
Sure. So for a long time, I mean, as a journalist, I've seen that most of the action in at least in Delhi, and air pollution is definitely not limited to Delhi, it is a national issue, it is driven by the court. You know, all these headlines jump at you about, you know, how you're in a gas chamber, this is emergency, and no action has been taken, people are dying. So Shibani, what is the role of the executive court on the issue of air quality, and where do we see it going?
First of all, I think it's a shame we have to call it an executive court, but I see where you're coming from, that they've been forced to perform that role, some perhaps more willing than others, some of the judges in the National Green Tribunal, the High Court, and the Supreme Court. So firstly, I think one of the reasons why it has become an NCR-centric problem, Mr. Mishra mentioned it, you mentioned, and it really is the way often it's viewed, is because the court is in Delhi. And it has always been viewed, and EPCA is based in Delhi. EPCA traditionally only looked at issues. So all of that is kind of a a cycle going on, kind of feeding into it. But I think things are changing now. I think the court is also cognizant of its own limitations, and hopefully it'll be even more cognizant of its limitations. But I think the role that the court can play, certainly less in the executive jurisdiction, is to ensure there's no backsliding. In the sense that if there is some law, or if there is some regulation, or there is some level of scrutiny, through executive or legislative action, that should not become more lenient or less. And that's, I think, a crucial role that the court should perform. I think it did that in the case of BS6, where it put its foot down and said, no, nothing doing, we're not pushing the thing. So that's something that I think the court should certainly be doing. The court is perhaps better placed when it comes to point sources of pollution, or perhaps looking at regulatory processes where irrelevant considerations or the process in which a decision has been made can be challenged. So for a question that, an issue that comes to my mind is the power plant emission norms. It's something that the court has been cognizant of, it's before the courts, yet the government has done what it has done, and I think the court is very well placed to put its foot down in this, but it hasn't done so. But something like NCAP, something like policy making, something, and we've mentioned that, it's something that requires political will, it requires interinstitutional coordination, those are not things which are where the court is comfortable, the court doesn't perform well, and when it does force itself to perform, then the outcomes are not necessarily what we want.
Yeah. Yes.
Shivani, happy that you said it. I just leave a question with you for future. Do you feel that there are far too many people trying to regulate air quality without responsibility lying with any of the bodies that have been created today?
I just want to add to that question. I think there are too many NGOs also trying to solve the problem. Every week some NGO lands up. In the last 3 years, it's got funding from somewhere. I don't know from where. Farmer organizations get no funding, but I think so. There's so many NGOs talking about air quality now.
That's quite true. There's no dearth of experts on air quality to be quoted, even for journalists. But another follow-up question, sir. Delhi is definitely not where air pollution is limited to. I mean, we know that there are places where there are coal mines, and we don't even know what's the air quality like in those places. And in peri-urban areas, I'm sure, for example, if you talk about Indo-Gangetic plains, several towns in Uttar Pradesh must be recording higher pollution levels than Delhi. So how do you ensure that we have the same transparency in terms of data dissemination and policy making when it comes to rural and peri-urban areas?
See, I began by saying that air quality is not about NCR. And I strongly believe in it, but there is a reason why this is happening. Your measuring stations per 1,000 population are all clustered in Delhi. So many of the places outside Delhi, let's say in UP and Bihar, really do not even know what their quality is. So that is the first point. That's why and I think the problem is far more acute in peri-urban areas. The reason being that some of the technologies which the metros and other cities are able to use is not available in those peri-urban areas. So when we talk about shutting down power plants, for example, thermal power plants, it's NCR. I can at least tell you that there are 150 power plants across the country which need to be shut today. Because more than producing electricity, they produce bad quality air. But nobody is looking at that. Habits are changing in peri-urban and rural areas. Waste management habits are changing. Mobility habits are changing. Small industries are coming up everywhere with no control. And I would agree with Mr. Jakhar that, for all bodies, it's best not to look at them. But the problem is also somewhere else, and I would like to flag this issue. Is this a matter of political discourse in India? Is air quality going to get votes for anyone? Unless it becomes a critical issue of political discourse, I don't think we are getting anywhere. And particularly so in the peri-urban and rural areas where people do not really understand the ill effects. So there is no voice. Delhi, for example, has a voice. For the good or bad, there are NGOs who are screaming that it's very bad quality air. But yet another thing about peri-urban and rural areas is that it is far more eminently doable than it is in the metros today. So that's a low-hanging fruit we are completely missing on. And the airshed approach would certainly be of extreme help, but we must remember that air quality is not about boundaries. We are trying to fix it geographically, which is not the best solution. And one way of doing it is, I think, strong IC in peri-urban and rural areas. More than technology, more than manpower, it is the knowledge which is essential.
Mr. Mishra, I wanted to ask you something for a long time because you have been part of the conceptualizing of NCAP, and now a lot of reviews are being done of how this is proceeding. And we noticed that the way the reviews are being done is that PM10, which are the coarse particles, are being considered for the review on whether they're meeting the goals or not, and not PM 2.5, which could be because there's no data on PM 2.5, but wanted to understand from you, where does this leave us? Because it may give us a very erroneous picture of progress.
Surely it will, because the coarser particles, which is PM10, is actually coming from construction, from dust and other places. And to be very honest to you, in rural areas and peri-urban areas, you have very little control over that. What you can control possibly is PM 2.5, which we are not looking at. Right. The sources largely in those areas are small industry and transportation. Yes. And we can do that, but one of the reasons, as I said initially also, is that we don't know the measurements. And the second reason is that somehow or other, we do not find it important enough to intervene in areas where there is no opposition to what is happening. Sure. It's not a uniform policy. We need to come to a uniform policy. And let me also share that when NCAP was being written, one of the thoughts behind it was that let us prepare an all-India document. Unfortunately, it's not yet got there. Hopefully it will in future, but it has to be an all-India document. 110 cities or whatever is based on a measurement scale, but it will have to be done everywhere.
Right. Shivani, what do you think are the 2 or 3 big ticket reforms that we need to see substantial improvement in air quality in our cities?
Right. I think we've spoken about the airshed regulation, and I think that really needs to be part of the law. I mean, it's good that it's part of a policy, but now it needs to have the regulatory bite, and therefore some form of, whether it's an institutional rejigging or some new amendments to the law. I think there's enough in the current law to introduce it, but whatever, it has to find some regulatory design, and there has to be an institutional mechanism to ensure that air quality is regulated at that level. And also to say that it's not just the Indo-Gangetic plains, but as you mentioned, there are other parts of India also where there's an airshed level issue of air quality. The second issue is, I think we really need to move towards stronger enforcement. And given the way we are structured, pollution control boards perhaps don't have the capacity, but that's not to say that those who are responsible for polluting should not be held responsible and accountable, as Sir mentioned earlier. The issue of accountability, I think, really needs to be looked at. And this is something some of us at CPR have written about, is kind of the regulatory, like the graded enforcement protocol, because we have limited capacity, and therefore what we need is that the most egregious offenders need to be predictably and strongly held to the law. And just finally, I think we're talking about institutional strengthening. I know there's political willingness is required, you need state governments to align. All of that is true, but there's also some bit of legal redesigning that's required. Right. Why should the chairperson of the Pollution Control Board not by law be a full-time chairperson? I mean, right now it's up to the state government whether they want to. So there are a lot of these. Why should the board be composed of people who are most likely to have conflict of interest? Municipal corporations, industry association, Department of Industries, all of them are likely to be conflicted with issues of pollution control. So why by law are they permitted to be on the board? So, I mean, some of these issues, I think, through regulatory redesign needs to happen now.
Yeah, yeah. Mr. Jakar, I wanted to understand what is the farmer's perspective, because we've heard a lot about techno-fixes on the stubble burning issue, and even this time the Commission for Air Quality has actually released an action plan which has in situ and ex situ provisions, but it doesn't really talk about what does the farmer want, how does he plan to manage this problem?
Farmer doesn't plan to manage the problem, so let's put that up front. But every transformation will have winners and losers, and losers will have to be compensated. The short-term pain needs to be addressed for a long-term solution to come. The system is not geared to address that pain. If the farmers are expected to change the way they farm so that there is less air pollution and there's less of other problems, then financially they'll need to be compensated in a way that they can make that change for the betterment of the community. Now, making that transformation has a cost, and farmers are expecting the government to share that cost, and the government is not ready to share that cost. Having said that, even farmer unions don't support the government, even though there is a realization amongst all farmers today that burning of crop residue is bad, but they still burn it because the immediate requirement is to put food and basic essentials on the table and in the house for the family members, and that's a big issue. The government, you have to address a short-term pain, and that could be anywhere in the world.
Sure. And do you see any long-term transitions happening? I mean, these are, of course, in the short term, there would be, I've spoken to a lot of farmers who said direct subsidy is what we are looking for, and that may help us. But some farmer groups have also told me that maybe if there's an MSP for other crops, we may want to change the pattern of our cropping.
So if you want to stop crop burning in North India, you have to reduce the paddy on the field. There's too much paddy. End of it. You can create any ex situ, you can create any in situ, you can give financial incentives. Crop burning is not going to stop because there is too much paddy growing. And you got to stop that. It's not only bad for the water table, it's bad for biodiversity loss, it's bad for occupational diversity, which is required in the villages, which is not there because you're only growing one crop, which is mechanized. And for that, you need to address open-ended procurement of paddy, you need to address free electricity. For all that, you need political will, which is lacking, and replacement of paddy by giving MSP to alternative crops will not suffice on a scale. It may work in some places, but it's not on its own. It's not enough, and you need to talk. I mean, when I say the government needs to talk to farmers on how to go about it, no short-term plan like the government came up with 1,000 crore rupees they gave for some mechanization. These plans are not going to work. You need a consistent plan for 5 to 7 years to have a behavioral change. It's just not about giving an incentive for 1 year or 2 years and things will change. You need to change the behavior of how people think and how they perform. And I want to just say one more thing which is required is the farmers have lost the trust of the government. And trust and faith is a very important thing. When Lal Bahadur Shastri ji had asked Indians not to eat once a week because food was in short supply, people willingly did it because people had faith and people had trust. Today, nobody trusts this government. And when I say this government, I don't mean the central government or the state government, I mean all governments. Till the governance does not improve, till the trust in the government does not improve, people are not going to be listening to this government. And which means that if the government says they're going to procure something, they will procure it. When there's a crop loss, farmers will get compensated for that. Like, government has to walk the talk, build that trust, and it has to be a long-term solution.
Can I add my 2 bits on the stubble burning? 2 issues. Uncomfortable discussion. Majority of the people disagree with this. First, whenever we talk about air quality in Delhi, the first conversation is about stubble burning. 20 days in a year? Maybe 30. How long does your bad air quality last? 3.5 months. How many fires have you counted in the industrial areas in the evening which is burnt after people close their factories and go? How much of smoke is that producing? I mean, we're just getting lost into nowhere. And the second question, I think we seriously need to ask, which no political structure would like to ask, is, do we need the rice in Punjab and Haryana for India's prosperity?
I think so. You should be asking that. You were in the government service. You should have asked your colleagues that question. Even this year, the government has said, grow more paddy, grow more paddy. So let's be very clear on this. The government of India, the government of Punjab does not want a reduction in paddy. They want monoculture to continue. They don't want biodiversity. And they want cheap grains to be grown. They really don't care about how the future generations are going to suffer. This problem started by the government, by central government policies to feed India, and it will only be solved when the central government picks up the tab for it. To expect government of Punjab to pick up the tab, it's not going to happen because it's a financially bankrupt state going downhill at a very fast rate. And India's food security, food systems, it's all linked together. It's all linked to who has the money, and it's the politics of food. Where are you going to spend the money? The government has just extended, I think so, just day before, free grains to the poor people by 3 months. I mean, if that's what government wants to do, then you need Punjab's paddy. You cannot do without it. Let's be very clear about it. Yeah.
Okay. On that note, let's open up for questions. If you have any questions to the panel.
My name is Leena Srivastav. I just had a couple of questions, possibly. I will stand up here just to be a little more visible. First is to Mr. Bhargav. I mean, it was a very stark presentation you made, and I really enjoyed listening to you. I was also wondering if you were able to collect any information on the extent to which the pollution control boards actually commission studies. So they don't have their own capacities. They don't have the right kinds of constitution. But are they able to commission studies? Do they have the finances to be able to do so? Are they empowered to do so? What are the constraints over there? My second question, I mean, I really enjoyed also listening to Ajay. I think I agree with almost everything that you said, and it was very refreshing to hear that. The question that comes to mind over here is whether it makes sense, and this is possibly also to all CPR colleagues who work quite a bit in the area of governance, for us to be distinguishing between the various arms of government and, in a sense, identifying where the problem lies between these different arms, or from a consumer or societal perspective, we look at them in the totality and expect that the different wings of the government would work together towards an end objective. And a question specifically to Mishra ji, good to see you here, Mr. Mishra, is whether the Ministry of Environment has willy-nilly weakened its own position by not having the strength of analysis, the strength of science behind, because it is a technical ministry, right? I mean, how do we correct this going forward? Because air pollution we have been talking about for 30, 40 years or more. But, these issues still remain. And to continuously wait for political guidance in areas where we are empowered or we expected or we have the accountability may not be the best approach. So would love to hear your views on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Srivastav. I think the answer to your first question, we are actually doing a separate analysis also on the finances of all of these 10 pollution control boards, which will also be released with these other 3 reports in the 3rd week of October. So stay tuned for that. Short answer, do they spend money on R&D or even commissioning other work? No. And they're all very well off financially from our analysis. So it's not a question of them not having the money, it's a question of whether they have the autonomy, whether they choose to make these decisions to commission external work if they need to.
I mean, I don't think so there was a question for me, but I would want to say about research is, I think so the bigger question is who funds the research? I mean, I've seen it in the farming sector. Who funds the research? And is the funding of research, let's say on pollution, is it funded in a particular sector to keep the narrative away from a different sector? I think that's the bigger question. These targets you're going to have a COP27. Every time they will come up with objectives nobody will adhere to, you know. So it's like setting targets, it's like setting objectives, it's like setting narratives. You have sustainable development goals. Every multilateral UN, NGO agency is talking about sustainable development goals. And as a farmers organization, we've been challenging, not one of them will be met by 2030, not one. And you will see in 2026, 27, we'll have another target, and they'll forget the SDG goals. Same as with net zero, it's again linked to air pollution, it's linked to the a systems approach. They will change the narrative when time is there. We're failing in all these objectives, we're failing in all these targets. We are being failed by the media, let's put it very clearly. They're not talking about it as it needs to be talked about. And I really agree on one of the things is that we talk about pollution only when we see it, and when we can smell it, and when we can breathe it. We talk about carbon, we don't talk about methane. So it's not an easy thing to address, but at the end of it, it's a governance issue. And I will, in fact, just one thing, when we took out a farmers policy in Punjab, and the first chapter on the farmers policy in Punjab was on governance. And an economist from IIM Ahmedabad actually wrote a critical editorial in the Tribune, and he said, what has a chapter on governance got to do with the farmers policy? Now I had to respond to that, so I wrote another article for the newspaper, and I read that without the chapter on governance, the farmers policy is not even worth the paper it's written on. So I think every problem needs to come down to governance. I think the people who are governing us, especially who are deciding the fine print, need to be educated. Everyone keeps saying farmers ko educate karo, they need to be educated not to burn the crop. I think it's the officers who need to be educated on how to make policy, on how to, the process. I mean, the Indian system of governing is so focused on setting an objective and then working backwards. It's wrong. I mean, as a farmers organization, what we've learned is the process is the key. We've got to focus on the process to find the objective first clearly. And that's where the key difference between thinking from the ground and thinking from the top is. There are basic fundamental differences on how to solve the problem.
Okay. Just to add to what Bhargav said, majority of the state pollution control boards are pretty rich. They don't, and particularly in the industrial areas, they're pretty rich. He's right, there is no commissioning of a study, there's no report, there's no research. And one of the major reasons for that is, if you look very carefully of what they are supposed to do, this is not one of the mandates they have. So they are to be blamed, but not entirely. Now the second issue on science and Ministry of Environment. Ministry of Environment physically is half scientists, half non-scientists. Technically, there's a lot of scientific work happening. Effectively, how much of that actually makes a part of the decision making is the critical issue. And that is where we often get lost, because we are not using them. There's a lot of work happening in other departments also. It's not essential that the Ministry of Environment itself hosts all the scientific studies. There are other science departments which are doing it. It's about Ministry of Environment's ability to absorb the scientific knowledge and then make policies reflective of a change on the field. And as Mr. Jakar was just saying, bureaucrats need to be educated. And certainly that should happen as any other person in the country. This whole concept of telling everybody that you need to change needs to be accompanied by a solution and an outlining of what really needs to be done rather than the concept. I think that is what will bring about change.
Thank you, ma'am. I mean, there's a lot of optimist talk, but I'm going to talk pessimism. So please bear with me. Please bear with me. My issue is why we are not getting anywhere so far. And it's not only in India, in this part of the world, that is Pakistan, Bangladesh, and everywhere, we're not getting anywhere. Why? That is a question. That's a question. Because the politicians and the people at the helm of affair have conditioned the mind of the population, of the people, to accept can be, should be, ought to have been done. This have to be done, will be, need to be, and we will. We are stuck with the will be done. Right, ma'am, please.
Sir,
Right.
what's your question, sir?
No, this is my question. This is my question.
I've got
The
your question.
Issue is we are not getting anywhere and we will not get anywhere. That we are not getting anywhere and we will not get anywhere because, as the gentleman have just said, political will starts with the vote bank and political will ends with the vote bank. It has nothing to do with the issues that we should understand.
Sure. We'll take a few more questions. We'll take a couple of more questions together and then panel can.
Mr. Jakar mentioned a very important point about the loss of trust that the farmers have. And something which I wanted to extend as a question to all the panelists here was, if the farmers have lost trust, shouldn't the government's approach change from the fact that instead of telling farmer what he or she needs to do, it should be about what they know about the situation on ground and try to tweak policies in which the government listens to the farmer rather than always tells what the farmer is supposed to do.
We've been trying for 10 years. I mean, I'll just leave it at that.
My question was more related to like the NGT's role. So basically, it's more on like water pollution. But when we talk about the NGTs, like the rules and regulations are very environmentally gentrified sort of. So what the role NGT plays on evictions of farmers and like dhobis, for instance, because like they're talking about the NGTs like they're working towards environment and conservation and preservation, but the people there are actually like still struggling, like because they're evicted or their like places are demolished and stuff. So like, what do you think of that? And because these environmental rules and laws, they're just very specific to environment and they're very exclusive in sorts of people. So I just wanted to know about what do you think on that?
Just a couple of questions. Probably for Mr. Mishra. How much are these bans, which we typically see during the winter season, construction ban on industries, are driven by actual science than by public sentiment or the lack of ability to regulate and enforce? And the second question is probably to all the panelists. As a professional who works in the air quality space, I think the most contentious issue in air quality is data transparency, because we get so many conflicting data points on a day-to-day basis on air quality. Like right now, the AQICN application is showing that Delhi is already breathing unhealthy air quality levels. But if you look at the Sameer app, we're still somewhere between moderate to poor. So who should be responsible for reconciling these conflicting data sets which potentially portray very dissimilar images? So yeah, those are my two questions. Thank you.
To the first question of not getting angrier, let us not blame anyone else, including politics or whatever. You are not getting angrier because you don't know what is hitting you. The day we have that knowledge, the day the people get to know what is happening to them, the anger will come. To the other issues on rules and regulations. See, rules and regulation laws, unfortunately, whenever they are framed for a specific issue. So much of the public thing that people's thing that you are talking about gets lost. It is in the implementation stage that you have to really build around that. So expecting every rule to be addressing a generic kind of a thing is a little difficult because they're by design made for specific issues. And now coming to your two questions. One is ban, whether it is for public sentiment or on science. Much of it is science. Science because once you understand source apportionment, you know which part is causing the maximum pollution, you try and control that by stopping it. But certainly some of it is also for impact. I mean, it may not help in the long run, and I'm not going to mention schemes and programs that have been run on this basis. But I have another thought. It's a random thought which I'll share with you. At times, it's good to have a couple of these impact things going because it at least sets everybody thinking. So it's not a bad idea at all. The second thing you said, where is the transparency? Samir app says something else, somebody is saying something else. Let us first understand the science behind it. What Samir app is doing is an average of all the monitoring stations that I have across Delhi, and then they give you a 24-hour AQI. What other apps are doing is, they are taking the ambient air here and giving you the air quality here. So there will always be a difference. If you ask me, air quality is not a permanent thing in a particular space. Therefore, it is better to go by the averages. The more science grows, the more industry grows, you'll get more apps which will tell you different things. But the fact remains that an accurate explanation of the air quality is when you take the entire geography into consideration and take an average of 24 hours.
Hello, here, one more. Yeah, may I take? Thank you very much, sir. I am not blaming the government. I am not blaming the science and technology. I am saying that planning is the main issue. Everybody, being a metro city, everybody cluster around here. There is no, industrial hub. There is no commercial hub. There is no any sort of, institutional hubs. So everybody is rushing to this place. So unless and until there is a good planning from the Urban Art Commission or any other bodies, I am not to blame anybody, whether it is industrialist or commercial or anybody. My submission is, can we do a better planning to bring a sustainable, city, like it's an international city. And if you play around like this, it becomes a dirty city, which is, insulting to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful panel so far. So I had one comment and following that a question. So Ajivir Jakar talked about how the farmers need to be compensated if their behaviors to change, and I think that's right. But there are others also whose behavior will need to change, and there are lots of potential losers in the short term. Industries might have to move to more expensive fuels. Individuals might have to give up status cars and actually move to, God forbid, public transport. All of these will require changes that may be perceived as costly, and they have to be convinced that the long-term benefit of cleaner air and the consequent health gains are worth those short-term costs. But they also have to be convinced that the changes are credible. And for that, we need both data, as the earlier questioner was saying, and a clear, commonly understood metric of how we're tracking progress, and a narrative that is credible. And that last context, I want to come back to something Jayashree said at the beginning. We are now being told that things are going swimmingly because PM10 is coming down, including in places like Varanasi and so on. And Mr. Mishra said, look, you know, yes, maybe PM10 is coming down, but I think most people, I understand, and I look to Bhargav and others for the details on this, it's not necessarily a sense that things are getting better. So is anybody actually calling out this narrative? Because my sense is if we think that we are actually solving this problem in a way that is painless, to actually solve this problem when that pain has to be accepted and distributed and compensated, people aren't going to be willing to do so. I think it's a very problematic narrative. And I think it's partly because there are a few easy wins in PM10, but also maybe some of the processes are changing where PM10 is actually being converted to PM 2.5. And actually what we care about is PM 2.5 and smaller. So maybe starting with a focus question then for Jayashree, is the media calling this out?
We did. We in fact asked the minister and also other officials because in the NCAP document it very clearly states that 20 to 30% reduction in PM 2.5 and PM 10 levels. Then we were told that there are certain concerns with data because the reference levels are for 2017. So data may not be available for the monitoring stations that are being monitored. But if it is only a data issue, I think there should be some way around it to ensure that we are also tracking the progress on PM 2.5. Otherwise, we are just ending up seeing whether dust is coming down or not in these areas, which doesn't.
I mean, absolutely. But Jayashree, I have a question. You were given an answer about data not being available for PM 2.5 across the country. I think the similar status stands for PM10 as well across the country. Why is the media not doing a deep dive to say that this is not true and this is true?
I mean, let me answer for Jayashree. Let me answer for Jayashree. Next 3 months, farmers are going to be blamed because farmers don't give advertisements to the media because they don't have money to give. No, let me answer. It's my choice. Very clearly. Farmers are going to be blamed because we don't give advertisements. Media does not talk about methane. It does not talk about other forms of pollution that industry is doing, about aquifers water being destroyed in aquifers. It's very clear. You can ask anyone on the street. They will say that the media is biased and media does what money tells them to do.
So
and one more thing. Let me just add to this.
Yeah.
It's not a laughing matter. I think it's a matter of life and death.
Yes.
And industry needs to be penalized. It does not need to be given incentives to change. They are there to make money. They need to be penalized. This whole idea of giving carbon credits the world over, and I'm not talking about Indian media. It's everywhere. You need to penalize things which are destroying the common goods of the planet. That's it.
No,
End of the story.
I want to respond actually to this, and I think there's a lot of angst against media in general. Yes.
Yeah, before Jayashree responds, the questions you put forward, while in government and now outside, you are the one we expect the answers from. If air quality has to succeed, experts have to come in with very specific views, those who know. And I think some of the plan, there was an issue about planning. It's not about planning, it's about good planning. And that is where we will need these inputs to really rectify what we think we are not doing too well. Jayashree, on your...
Yeah. Okay. No, I have introspected about this a bit. Firstly, one of the issues which is a general concern with the media is air pollution becomes a seasonal problem. And you see a lot of air pollution stories in October, starting October till the end of winter, and then no stories, which is a concern which personally I am trying to address through columns or through other kinds of stories. The other issue with the farmer problem is that it is a very complex problem. I think it is not even related to whether farmers are burning stubble or not. It's a very structural problem as to what we are eating and how it's contributing to air pollution. So I think the levels, the way we report also needs to be layered and more nuanced. And personally, I'm trying to do that, but I see that there is a concern with media in general, and we will definitely try to address that. And on that note, shall we close this, or any last comments? Yes.
My query is addressed to Mr. Mishra. I agree that farmers are being blamed. I do believe that there's too much of focus on the farmer issue. And we are neglecting the whole issue of transportation policy, because I do believe that you can bring down pollution levels dramatically if you rejig the transportation policy. So let me give you an example of where I think our transportation policy is being a little misdirected. We've come out with a scrappage policy, right? And the idea is to reduce the number of polluting vehicles on the road. I don't think it's going to have any effect, because the scrappage policy mandates that vehicles have to be scrapped after they at an age of 15 years and raised to 20 years. There's a study done by IIT Delhi, which looks at pilot study in Delhi, Visakhapatnam and Rajkot, which shows that only 1% of our vehicles are actually above that limit. I know this because I did some work coordinating a national initiative to get historical vehicles protected by the Ministry of Transport. And we showed to the ministry that from the statistics of the Government of India, out of the 32 crore vehicles in India, of which 70% are two-wheelers, the actual number of vehicles that are older than the cutoff limit is such a small percentage that it will neither feed a scrappage industry and nor will it have a market effect on pollution. We have one of the youngest fleets of vehicles in the world. The better way to address pollution from transportation would be to actually coordinate between the railways, the road, the Ministry of Transport and the Ministry of Environment. For example, if a lot of bulk transport, for example, we transport cars from our factories by road, it just doesn't make sense. We should be transporting them by rail. There are rail lines running. Where I live in Bangalore, you have the Kia factory, which is 100 kilometers away from Bangalore. You have beautiful railway line going next to it, but the Kia cars are being transported all over India by lorries. So I wanted to ask you whether there was any kind of a coordinating mechanism within the Government of India where you in the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Railways and the Ministry of Transport sat together and looked at how you could actually rejig transportation policy in a holistic way, move bulk transport from the roads to the railways, and so on and so forth, in order to bring down pollution as a whole. Was there any kind of mechanism?
Okay, to just straightway answer your question, discussions on various sectors getting together, but no policy discussion of an overall rejig. On the scrapping policy, I think country needs a scrapping policy. When, where, what, I mean, many of the concerns you have raised is perfectly valid, whether that is adequate or we can do it other ways without doing it. My only observation on this throughout has been that age of a vehicle is irrelevant. It is the emission level which is relevant, and that should be the norm. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure, we'll close this then. Thank you so much. This was a very, very useful, informative panel discussion.